welcome people who are joining. We're going to give a couple minutes so that everybody can get on. All right, 7:01 it is. So welcome everyone. So NAMI Massachusetts is presenting this series of panels that ask the question, what does it mean to truly achieve mental health for all? We have invited diverse panelists from the BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities to discuss issues of stigma, access, inequity, challenges, and healing. Our goal in hosting these panels is twofold. We hope not only to increase public awareness about how diverse communities think about and address mental health, experience specific barriers, contemplate changes needed, promote recovery and healing, and build resilience, but also to foster conversations around how othering impacts communities and what types of changes need to be advanced to achieve mental health for all. Thank you for joining us for tonight's LGBTQ plus panel. I'm going to introduce myself and the panelists who have joined us this evening, but first I want to go over a few logistics. We will have an opportunity for audience question and answers toward the end of this webinar event. Please type your questions into the chat at any point in time during the panel discussion. Eliza Williamson, a NAMI Mass staff member, will be managing the chat and will collect questions from the audience to ask panelists at the end. We welcome your questions. We have ASL interpreters here with us today. As such, we may take pauses at different points during the discussion today to allow the interpreters to switch places or catch up. We also have the auto-generated live transcript turned on for this event. The captioning may have some inaccuracies since it is computer generated, but hopefully it will still be helpful. So my name is Evan Rockefeller. I am a volunteer. I've been volunteering with NAMI Massachusetts since 2013, and I'm currently on the board of directors. And I'm going to go around and introduce each of the panelists. Thomas Brown is a trauma educator and has been a lead trainer of the Massachusetts Certified Peer Specialist Program. He is a regular guest lecturer at Harvard Medical School and in the Occupational Therapy Department at Tufts University. And he is the founding executive director of Seedlings Consultation and Training. He is also a member of the NAMI Massachusetts Board of Directors. Lorelei Lyons graduated from Bridgewater State University with a double major in music performance and philosophy. She has taught music privately. She now works as a peer support coordinator for Bay Cove Human Services, where she continues to use music, art, and philosophy to connect with people. Vesper Moore is a community activist, survivor, trainer, and writer. They are involved with the Kiva Centers as a certified trainer for the Massachusetts Certified Peer Specialist Program. They have worked as a consultant for the United States government and the United Nations in shaping strategies around trauma, intersectionality, and disability rights. Ashley Spruill is a certified peer specialist working at a peer-run crisis alternative drop-in center called The Living Room with advocates in Framingham. She is deeply passionate about peer support and racial justice work and is also a musician. So with that, we will jump right into our questions. I just want to say that many of these questions ask for thoughts and responses about how our community addresses certain issues. Of course, each panelist is speaking from their own experience, and we're not asking any one person to speak for an entire community, nor are we putting forth one person's thoughts as representative of an entire community. I just wanted to make sure that I said that. So our first question is, how do culture and identity influence how the LGBTQ plus community approaches mental health? And what impact, if any, do you think your culture and or identity have in how you approach your own mental health? And I'm going to ask Vesper to go first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, I can say as a Taino person that first off, I mean, I was raised Christian Hispanic, but my indigenous heritage and my family line views the experience of hearing voices or emotional distress as a form of like spiritual emergence, as a way of understanding ourselves, taking journeys inside to better understand our experiences on the outside. And I think that that expansiveness like really parallels queerness in the way where our behavior, our identity, who we are, how we interpret the world, how we express ourselves is much more expansive than how we are labeled and understood. And I think that when we talk about decolonizing mental health or decolonizing approaches, that is very important in the grand scheme of things. Just the idea that we are deconstructing the idea that we can label behaviors socially or identities in this way.
Wow, thank you so much. That is a really neat perspective on that. Who would like to go next? Go ahead, Thomas.
Okay. So again, it's difficult. I can't speak for my community because there are communities within my communities and communities within those communities, but I can speak of an individual from some of those communities and how I experience. But one thing it really stands out to me about this question is that I ask how culture affects, my communities, how it influences my community's approaches to mental health. And I would kind of turn that differently, and say that it's the way that my culture's discrimination against people from the LGBT community affects my mental health. It's that discrimination, it's the oppression that I experience that it affects my mental health. It's not so much how I and my community approach it, except that it sets up challenges in living. Our culture sets up challenges in living for people in the LGBTQ community. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Lorelai, would you like to go?
Yeah, what I have to say about this is sort of jumping off of what Thomas said. And for me, when I was thinking about this question, I thought so much about how, and this might be a repeated point for me throughout this entire thing, is that for a very long time, all of these things were considered mental health issues, and being transgender was in the DSM and still is. And they've changed the wording, but these things have been decided by people who are not transgender themselves, as before it was decided by people who were not gay themselves, or at least not out about it. And I say this a lot with the people that I support, but a doctor can provide us gender affirming treatment, and a therapist might be able to help us when it comes to trauma or oppression resulting from our trans status, so on and so forth. But the only people who can help us to navigate our situations in the world are other transgender people. And we could talk about this more later, but in particular for me, other transgender women, because even among transgender people, there's such a wide breadth of experiences. And that's kind of part of one of the things that makes it hard to begin with. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good point about the fact that, our identities have been pathologized as LGBTQ plus people. Yeah. So thank you for that. Let's go on to the next question. Question number 2 is, what internal barriers, beliefs, experiences, etc., and external barriers, social conditions, structural issues, lack of access to resources, etc., exist for you and other members of our community that hinder help seeking and access to mental health care? And I'll ask, Ashley, would you like to go first?
Sure. Hi, this is Ashley. Yeah, I think this question was hard for me, thinking about kind of the community aspect and then my own personal experiences. I think about, the internal barriers that have been there that have impeded my ability to seek care. Definitely have been more the external judgments around what care is and who should have access to care. What are the things that people are dealing with that make them worthy of being able to seek help? So that's kind of an internal thing that I think about, that I deal with regularly. But on a larger scale, I think a lot about the concept of intersectionality, and how a lack of intersectionality in many spaces creates these kind of hidden barriers for different groups of people. I think a lot about a story. One time I decided to utilize an LGBTQ plus partial hospitalization program. I'm not someone who's typically prone to want to use partials. I've never found them helpful. But I was kind of drawn to this partial because it was designed to, be for those who were like me in the LGBTQ plus community. And it was exciting to think about, seeking resources, expanding community, meeting people, making connections. But unfortunately, when I got there, I had an extremely negative experience. And in hindsight, I realize now it was racially motivated, the discrimination that I went through. And I remember feeling really torn by that, because it's like, this is a resource that is designed for marginalized communities where people can seek support. But then when I get there, it's my race now that is a barrier for me getting access to the same way that other people in the space did. So I think when we're thinking about it that way, we can have these spaces that are catered and trauma informed and safe spaces. But if we're not really thinking about how they impact folks on all levels with that intersectional view, it's not really for everyone. So I think that's something that's definitely kept me from seeking support. And other spaces is like, okay, I may fit in one category, but then there's another thing about me that cuts off that access. So I think intersectionality is one that very much keeps me and other people from pursuing different supports.
Yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I mean, I think that's intersectionality is just such an important thing for us to talk about, because you're right that so often it gets overlooked, even by programs and providers with the best of intentions. Who would like to go next?
I can go next. I would say, just in addition to intersectionality, but also just there is a white supremacist patriarchal idea of what being gay and being queer is. If you look in media, often when you see the portrayal of gay people, it is usually a young, gay, able-bodied white man who's attracted to another young, gay, able-bodied white man. And it's usually sensual without any form of expression of sexuality. And it is often in a higher class neighborhood, a suburb of some sort, and it's a secret that's coming out, right? It's not in the city with the BIPOC people, with the trans people who may be surviving on the streets, who may not live in the best conditioned apartments, who may be in these spaces, who are finding love in community. It is also often a monogamous perspective. It's not always polyamorous. There's not enough representation. And what this does, the societal influence, is it creates this idea in the heteronormative and the conventional mind, if you will, of what queerness looks like. and is a hindrance to accessibility in terms of mental health, because of the way in which people are understanding behavior, ways of being, and how they are labeling people with these diagnoses historically, like Lorelei was talking about earlier.
Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
So when I think about internal barriers, I really thought a lot about this. And, so often people who are given diagnoses are thought to have internal barriers. The problem is often centered in us, and we're the one carrying the problem. And really, when I think of barriers for me, sure, there's some internal barriers, but those come externally. It's the oppression, it's the terrorization of these communities that I'm a part of that have created that internal terror inside of me. So to say that it's, that there's this kind of isolated internal barrier, I think is really misleading. And because that internal barrier is also the exterior barrier. And just as in terms of like external barriers, there just simply aren't enough therapists or other helpers who identify as LGBTQ. It's just such a minority in the mental health helping profession. So that's one of the exterior barriers. And then, the other thing is that there's not enough funding to create programs. I mean, luckily in Boston, we have the Fenway Health Center, we've got the Triangle program, but we need a whole lot more resources like that. And again, because of the discrimination, we just don't get that funding. So.
Yeah, go ahead, Lorelei.
Yeah, so Thomas, that hit the nail on the head for almost exactly what I was going to respond with. I was going to say that there are a couple things I can think of that are internal barriers, but they have been ingrained in us from the society in which we live. And so these things might be church, they might be family, they might be the media, and for many of us, it can be the mental health programs themselves, because when you're trying to come to terms with this, they'll suggest many things that might lead you down the wrong path. And a lot of those things could be things like medications. And that's a whole world of its own, which I won't even necessarily go into, but I think that there are many more external issues that are easy to point to. The political dialogue around these things is very hard for a lot of us. And actually, Eliza shared with us, the Trevor Project released a study, and it says in that 96% of people who identify, I believe it was LGBT youth, said that the political dialogue has been detrimental, 96% of them, and it's not surprising at all. And I want to touch on this more later, perhaps, but because this is sort of pointing towards one of the last questions. But for me, I'm constant. Thomas was pointing out the lack of resources in our city, the lack of doctors and therapists, and so on and so forth. And it's wild to me to like consider our tax dollars and to look at how much we spend on foreign intervention with our military while people in our streets are homeless, while transgender people go without treatment. And I'll probably dive into that more in the last question, but yeah, the resources are very misallocated in our society.
I would like to add, there's a lot with these tangible resources, but simultaneously, there are resources that are put out there. The thing is that often those resources aren't accessible to us in the ways that they exist. and they're often involuntary resources. There's not enough voluntary community-led resources by trans people. We must have leadership of those most impacted. That is one of the principles of disability justice. And it's very applicable here when we talk about queer liberation, that we should have that type of leadership. Because if we want to reduce rates of re-traumatization, right, and we want things to be accessible, we have to make sure that those services are accessible in that way. It's not about, again, the problem being with us. It's about our systems and society being accessible to us. Systems and society are disabling. It is not the idea that there's something inherently wrong with us, as the rest of the panelists touching upon.
Thank you for summing that up so beautifully, Vesper. I am just thinking as I'm sitting here that I'm so grateful that all of you are involved in peer support work, because you are, representing our community and also, a multitude of intersections of identities. And I'm so grateful for your work. So we'll move on to the third question. How does the LGBTQ+ community address recovery and healing from emotional distress, trauma, and mental health conditions? And what do you believe is unique about the way our community addresses mental health?
Could I start this one off? Because this kind of piggybacks on the last thing that we were all just talking about. And I'd like to share my own personal experience with this a little bit, but I think that peer support is so crucial. As I said earlier, doctors can prescribe, therapists can help with trauma, but as far as navigating the world, we need to just talk to people with shared experience. Peer support is such a natural relationship for everyone that many people have had removed from their life artificially in one way or another. This question, how do we address recovery within our sort of affinity groups? I think that it's pretty amazing having grown up in the 90s, in particular with the advent of technology. When I grew up, the internet was a thing, but it wasn't sort of ubiquitous as it is today. And I was on the internet when I was very young, and it was a very interesting time because it wasn't quite as rigid as it is today. And I could talk about this forever, so I'll try and keep it brief. But I was actually exposed to peer support from online communities, and transgender people, for me, were a very early adopting group of internet users. And I was having dialogue with other people who are having my experience at a very young age online, when there was no one I knew in real life who would talk about these things. I didn't hear about these things from anyone in my life, but I was able to read people's accounts of these things online. I was able to learn about the possibilities. I was able to learn about experiences that didn't relate to me, but that opened my eyes to other people's experiences that may be tangential or parallel to my own. And I think that a lot of transgender people have really adopted the internet as a way of connecting, uniting, and sort of sharing and strategizing and just giving each other support.
Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
So, yeah, I would just agree with everything that Lorelei says. And again, I can't speak for my community because there are so many communities, but I can speak to what I've experienced in my community. And so we do tend to, or I tend to create little families, within my community. And that is something I've seen over the years that other people in these communities do. So we need that safety. I think of it as an adopted family in the way that Lorelei expressed. But there are a group of LGBTQ people that I get together with, the same group of people every holiday. And I find that so necessary. I live in a culture that typically often hates me, and in which I do not feel safety. I, was in North Station not too long ago before the pandemic began, and there was a hockey game, and during the break, these guys were calling each other gay and calling, that's so gay. And the level of fear, even though I can pretty well take care of myself, the fear that I felt in my body just it became fierce. I realized that like I was not safe in that environment, and I feel that walking down the street so often. Depends on which kind of communities I'm walking in. There's some communities that are a lot more machismo than others, so having that family, that sense of safety, I feel like is just absolutely essential. And by the way, and mental health doesn't just mean going for services. And that often the way that we create our, positive mental health is through having a community and having that safety and speaking with each other. So I just want to make clear that like mental health doesn't just mean using services. There are all sorts of other ways of achieving that.
Ashley, are you going to go? Yeah, go ahead, Ashley.
I just want to give the interpreters a minute to switch. Yeah, I really appreciated the points that both Lorelei and Thomas made. I think a lot about the sharing of information, finding places and spaces in which maybe safety isn't completely achievable, but safe enough in which we can kind of share our experiences. Thinking about the example I gave previously about being part of a partial hospitalization for LGBTQ plus folks. That was the piece that made it so tragic for me for it to not work out, was I lost that sense of, hey, I'm going to get information, I'm going to learn more about, this history that I want to be a part of and learn more about the community that I wish to join. So I think that lack of access, that lack of the ability to find information and share it with one another is so important. I think a lot thinking like racially when it comes to education, right? Like being a Black woman in America, I was raised in the white American school system. So there are even things about my own history as a Black person I've never learned because there hasn't been the opportunity to have those pieces of information highlighted. We kind of get the general overall story of Rosa Parks, MLK, great, racism over. And so I think for me as an adult, there's been a lot of wishing to go back and do that same history for my queerness to be able to learn more about those that came before me. So I think the ability to have that access to, folks who have been in the fight longer, I think that's something that people in my community have mentioned, being able to talk to older folks and hear their experiences about what they've been through and how that relates to us today. I think that's an important piece. And I think what you said, Thomas, around, mental health doesn't just mean seeking services. I think for me, thinking about not pathologizing our experiences as LGBTQ people, that sense of safety, right? Again, talking about race, there have been times where I express, I don't feel safe because of the color of my skin. I don't feel safe because of being, queer. And then how quickly systems tend to pathologize that. Oh, you're anxious. You're paranoid. What do you think is really going to happen to you? Right. And I think if we're talking about moving towards better mental health for all, scaling back that pathologizing nature of how we talk about our experiences. And like Vesper was saying earlier, allowing folks within our community to use the language that they want to use for their own experiences. We're not coming up with things based on what we think we know about a group or culture, but allowing those within that culture to speak for themselves. And so I think that's one of those things that I've noticed my community, the LGBT community, reclaiming that stuff more like, nope, I know how I'm going to talk about myself. I have a friend who describes herself as the biggest dyke in the world. And I cannot tell you how funny it is to watch people's reactions when she calls herself that. Because it's like, what? No, that's an oppressive word. Why would you ever say that? And when people ask her, why do you use that language? She's like, that's what I am. And I'm allowed to reclaim that for myself. So I think that's another way that we've been addressing kind of some of this trauma, is being able to reclaim terms and phrases and language that are meaningful for us, and being able to give them different meaning based on where we're at in our lives. So I think, yeah, definitely appreciate that, Lorelei and Thomas.
Beautifully said, Ashley. I heard themes of, reclaiming terms that have been used against us, and then also a lot about sort of the idea of chosen family and the way that that can support our mental health as well. So let's move on to the next question. This one is a little bit of a long one. The definition of othering from Powell and Menendian of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley is a set of dynamics, processes, and structures that engender marginality and persistent inequality across any of the full range of human differences based on group identities. Dimensions of othering include, but are not limited to, religion, sex, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status or class, disability, sexual orientation, and skin tone. Powell and Menendian state, although the axes of difference that undergird these expressions of othering vary considerably and are deeply contextual, they contain a similar set of underlying dynamics. So the question is, how does othering impact our community, specifically related to mental health and wellness? And how does othering impact your own mental health? Who would like to go first? Go ahead, Thomas.
Oh, I happily start this one off. So othering can be deadly. And so living in a deadly situation can be traumatic. And I'll give one example for me. I mean, it's obviously in LGBTQ community that othering is incredibly deadly and dangerous. So when I was growing up, I was 11 when I found out that, you know, I was really in love with this other kid, my friend, a male in my school. And that same year, it was 1979, it was in Tennessee. And there was this man who had been away to college, who had grown up in Tullahoma. And while he was at college, he decided to be absolutely who he was and not hide who he was anymore. He felt very feminine. He was gay. He was proud of being gay. And so he started dressing the way that he felt and the way that he was very proud of. When he came back home for Christmas break to my hometown, and by the way, this was a really progressive town. It was considered like, you know, a lot of smart people. And when he came back one night at 10 o'clock, he was getting gas at a gas station. And these two senior high school students got out and nearly beat him to death with a crowbar. The person who was the cashier in the gas station didn't call first responders for an hour because in her mind, the person got what he needed. So he was left to bleed out there nearly to death. The DA, district attorney, did not press charges, did not press for an investigation. There were no charges brought. There was no effort to find out who these two people were. Because the hatred was so strong, it was considered, this is just the way things are. 2 weeks later, I was in my bedroom. My older brother was in his bedroom with two friends, and they were getting really loud and laughing. And to my horror, and again, this is somebody who just discovered that I was a gay, that I was attracted to men when I was 11. His two friends started joking about how they wished they had finished the MF off. So these were two people in my house who had actually committed that act, and they were two people I grew up with. And that was my introduction to being a gay man in this culture. And of course, killings and beatings were widespread then, and they continue to be really widespread. That's that's the power of othering. Ultimately, that's the end of othering, is that it can kill, that it can be very deadly. There are all sorts of other things along that spectrum that are extremely harmful. Feeling like we don't deserve to be a part of the broader community. Again, not having resources that are available to us that are available for other people. Being discriminated against in the workplace, for being gay. I've experienced that so many times. And sometimes it can be so subtle, but it has such a profound effect. So that's my experience. There are so many other like microaggressions that happen through other, like being in a meeting and knowing that people are discounting you or aren't listening to you much as they're listening to other people, because your value as a human being is discounted. So that's all I have.
Thank you for sharing that story, Thomas. And so sorry that you had to go through that. Having somebody so close to you having done something like that. Who would like to go next?
I would. Just in terms of othering, I'd like to use an example of intersectionality. For example, a lot of disabled folks are not viewed as sexual beings. And then trans folks within themselves are not inherently allowed to or viewed as spiritual beings because they're viewed as heathens because of a popular Christian heteronomy that we live in our society. And I think when we talk about othering and we talk about queer liberation and the reclamation of the term queer, it is the very idea of countering the culture of convention that seeks to oppress us and marginalize us in the way that was described. And it happens to a multifaceted degree where BIPOC people within queer circles are often oppressed by other queer folk, where trans folk are oppressed within queer circles as well, where non-binary folk are. And it is this horrible thing of oppressed people who end up oppressing each other. And it's systemic and it's social, and we end up othering each other. And I think when we think about queer liberation and what we can do in that regard, I think about how can we actually broaden our understanding. I was using some of those social examples earlier of representation, because without that representation, children and youth in our society will not see that, and that will not alter the culture that we need in order to, again, liberate queer folks.
I really appreciated what you shared, Vesper and Thomas. I think about the concept of othering being dangerous, and like there's actual real life or death consequences to othering groups of people. I mean, how many times have we seen that historically in society, right? Genocides, mass death from the concept of isolating a group of people and deciding that they, for any reason, don't deserve to have access, not even just to basic needs, but to be happy. And I think that's a concept that doesn't get talked about enough when we're talking about marginalized groups. It's not just like, oh, how do we make sure that people have just enough that they need to get by? People in those groups deserve to feel happy and be relaxed and have rest and have converse and have community in that way. And so I think when we're talking about how dangerous it is to isolate groups, it really is from top to bottom. And I think piggybacking off of that, I think about going back to like kind of these internal barriers. I think a lot about how even if you're not at risk for being the victim of a macroaggression, we're talking about these systemic things. For example, people with mental health diagnoses, especially people who are queer or who are under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, often aren't able to get adequate medical care. That's one thing I was thinking about recently. I knew a guy many years ago who actually considered buying his testosterone shots off the black market because he was worried about finding a doctor that would work with him. And so I think often when there's not enough options presented, or people are either intimidated or shown that they don't deserve to have those options, we tend to make unsafe choices just to be able to get by. I think a lot about times where I've gone to the doctor asking for support and care, and they'll even start with asking questions of like, oh, are you sexually active? Is there a risk that you're pregnant? Blah, 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 blah. And it's like, even the way some of the questions are asked in these systems are designed to perpetuate this oppression. And so I think, yeah, it's definitely the macro scale of like, yeah, people obviously get murdered and killed for being part of our community, but then there's these internal systemic things that we experience where it's like, I don't like going to the doctor. I could have my eyeball hanging out and I'm probably not going to go because of this worry of the discrimination that I've experienced and other people in our community have experienced. And yeah, I just really appreciated that example, Thomas, because I think it shows just top to bottom how there's these wide scale, very obviously unokay acts of aggression, but then there's the smaller things within us and the systemic things that we experience every day that really highlight that. So I really appreciated that.
So there's definitely a lot of external stuff, but I just think it's important to note too that it's not just murder and attacks, but it's also suicide. And you know, again, just pointing to the Trevor Project survey, it said 42% of trans youth have attempted suicide at some point, and that's extreme. It's just so common. And again, yeah, it just like really reinforces all this. And I thought about what I was going to say for this question, and I really think for me it's important to share about how my experience as someone who intends to be stealth or to not disclose my transgender identity to people plays into this. Because right now, I'm someone who actively shares my story with many people, as I'm doing in this webinar. But I intend one day to move and to uproot my life and to leave everything around here. And the amount of mental toll that takes on me every single day, because I'm going to a job and I don't want to establish a connection with any of my coworkers because I don't want to be friends with any of these people. I don't want to know people from before I'm the person that I'm trying to be. And so it feels like right now, like as someone in this particular situation, that I can't establish a meaningful relationship with anyone. And this is only part of it because, you know, also it's important to remember that there's a huge turnover problem in our world. And what the system is doing is basically having transgender people like apply for jobs and work just to get these affirming procedures they're entitled to, and then they just quit and they move away, and that's what's going to happen. And then you look at when I arrive to wherever I move to, and I'll be in a situation where every single day, everyone I meet doesn't know about this huge chunk of my life. And there's a lot there to unpack as to how much mental toll that will take. But then you get back to the death, the fear of like reprisal for my transgender status. How many transgender women, especially obviously not a concern for me, but like transgender women of color are killed every single year because someone finds them attractive and then finds out that they are transgender. And the fear that someone who it seems loves you is actually repulsed by you because of their own like self-hatred, really, at the end of the day. But these nuances are things that just apply to like my one situation, and they manifest themselves in extremely different and profound ways for each one of us. We all have different ways where this othering like shapes the way that we live our lives, and it's very deeply hurtful. I only barely touched the surface of all of the ways that these things affect me now, and they will affect me in the future. And it's very unique for each one of us. And I've talked enough. I've talked so long, so I'll stop.
That is totally okay, Lorelei. Thank you so much for sharing, that very personal story and perspective on that. I will go on to the last question, which is a short one, but probably has longer answers. The question is, what do you think are the critical next steps to take in achieving mental health for all?
I can go. So just in terms of the last question, in terms of what we were talking about, I'm reminded of a statement that is called "Be gay, do crime." And what that statement really entails historically is that our society views it as criminal for us to exist, for trans people to exist, for queer people to exist. And when I think about mental health for all, I also think about the connotation and the intersection of how it is criminal to have a mental health diagnosis and to exist in this society in the way that we do. It is criminal to just exist in a space, and because someone else objectifies your body, the choices you are making, and they find out something about you, which is indeed the person you were, your dead name, anything about who you were, that they feel within themselves that they have the privilege to ruin you or your life, or in some instances kill you. So when I think about mental health for all, it's really thinking about, again, more voluntary peer-run resources in the context of the LGBT community, having these resources be in both its inception, its creation, its development, its every piece of the process being decided by queer folks for queer folks. Otherwise, it will never be accessible. We will never have mental health for all.
Yeah, thank you for that answer, Vesper. Go ahead, Ashley.
I really appreciated what Vesper shared. Finding community peer supports for the people, by the people, who utilize them. And I think one thing I think about too, this question kind of stumped me when I read it. I was like, mental health for all. What does that mean? What does that look like? And I think really for me, it comes down to redefining what mental health really is. I think it goes back to Thomas's point around, we tend to pathologize these experiences so heavily when really it's human beings just trying to exist in the real world and make connections and have a life that's worth living and have access to relaxation, to fun, to, work, things that, help make people's lives what they are. And I think if we're really considering mental health for all, it's that intersectionality piece that Vesper was mentioning, but also, I don't know, kind of taking a bit of the mystery away from the experiences that we have and just seeing us as people who, this is just our life. And I think removing that pathologizing nature is one thing that I think about in my work as a peer support person in general. But when applying it to this topic, I think really just seeing LGBTQ plus folks for who they are and not having this sort of mental health lens or view in front of it. But I think that's definitely a question I'll be thinking about more just over time in my work of like, what does this really mean to have access and to create spaces in which people can talk about what they need to talk about and get support, without any obstructions or barriers. So I think that's a good question that I'm still going to be thinking on.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I think I'm the one person here who is not a peer support worker, and I've only sort of recently encountered the peer support movement and culture, and the way that the peer support movement moves away from pathologizing people and sees us all as just people who are living life and need support because life is hard. I think is really important. Who would like to go next? Go ahead, Thomas.
I'll go, and unless Lorelei, I didn't know if you were getting ready to. Okay, so I'll go back to what I was saying before at the beginning of this, is that so often we think of, we center the problem within people. So obviously from this conversation, we can see that we experience a lot of trauma, a lot of terrorization, and then our responses to those experiences are called mental illness. And that scapegoats us. And it also gives society a free card, so that they don't have to take responsibility, so that we don't have to take responsibility to that. And and then that being considered, mentally ill, then becomes a trauma within itself, and then people start reacting to us in certain ways, the mental health profession, and there's a lot of psychiatric oppression that goes on with that. So I think my conception of mental health for all would be ending oppression for all, that we really focus on not oppressing each other. And in a sense, I think there is some reckoning with how much we traumatize each other as a culture and as societies around the world. There's a proliferation of trauma therapies now, therapies that are coming out now, and they just keep coming and coming. And I almost, maybe I'm too optimistic or Pollyanna, but I kind of feel that we're, as a species, at a point of beginning to reckon with trauma, how much we hurt each other, and why we need not to hurt each other. So I'm feeling a little bit hopeful about that. But I think mental health for all, for me, means ending oppression for all groups.
In my own notes, I had ending oppression for this one too. For this, there's been something that has been blowing my mind recently, and I've been sort of sharing it with all of my coworkers because I'd never connected these two thoughts. And part of my own experience was that I joined the military when I was young, and it was very hard being a closeted trans woman in the military. But this is not really related to that experience as much as to say that I was part of an intelligence battalion. We were charged with collecting information and then reporting it. And as such, a lot of this work was done from detention facilities. Now, I was part of a team of 5 people with 5 intelligence specialists, which is part of a squad with 10 people, all intelligence specialists. Part of a platoon, that's about 40, and in a company, you can multiply that by 4 or 5. And then there's the battalions and the brigades. And all those people are operating detention facilities in foreign countries. And so one team of about 5 people is supporting about 80 detainees that America has put in prison, mostly for attacking Americans. And we don't have to look at that logic right now. But on my team at Bay Cove Human Services, we get 3 peer support specialists to support about 120 people who need services in America. There's 21 peer specialists at Bay Cove as a whole. So literally, detainees in foreign countries that America is detaining get more one-on-one human interaction and support than do disabled and struggling people who are American citizens within their own border, who have often lived through significant trauma, homelessness, oppression. And, I think about the use of our funding, and it's just mind-blowing to me. And so we talk about mental health for all, and to me, it seems like if there were reversed numbers at least, or if we could just take that money and help the people in our own country, that would start to help a lot. And I'll stop.
Yeah, thank you for circling back around to that issue of resources, Lorelei. Yeah. So we are done with our planned questions. I did want to give an opportunity before we move into questions from the audience, if there is anything that anyone on the panel wants to talk about as far as, anything, current events that have happened within sort of the political climate, anything that is on your mind as affecting our mental health as members of the LGBTQ plus community.
I think that the constant bombardment of trans people's like rights to exist and the political dialogue is something that is constantly terrifying. Every day I'm terrified to look and see what one of our like rights will be restricted next. And it's even worse to see these things being targeted against youth of all people. And then it's even more disheartening to just know that we have all these global issues and we're talking about who can play volleyball. It's pretty wild to me.
So yeah, the Trump administration was pure hell for me. And some of the first people to go into the concentration camps and into the ovens and the German Holocaust were LGBTQ folks. And I started realizing, I used to think to myself, my God, how could the Holocaust happen? And yet when Trump became president, I started seeing how that could happen. And when he started attacking LGBTQ, IA communities, it was just, I thought, my God, if he gets a second term, where will we be? What will happen to us? And so politics as reflects, it reflects people's values. And I didn't know that there were so many people who had those kinds of values until he took office. And of course, they're still around. And as these rights, these policies, the rights are being restored, the policies are being undone that targeted us. You see this enormous, fight against that happening. In my home state, the governor of Tennessee today signed into law a denial of trans youth to have life-affirming surgery. And so we're just, going backward. And that's just really frightening for me. And it just adds to the fear. So yeah, no, thank you for asking that question. It's a really important one. And politics is very, very loud. So for me personally, it affects me deeply.
For me, I immediately am thinking of detention centers. The fact that they, sparked up in such prevalence during the Trump administration, and yet, they haven't been on the radar at all. My people are in detention centers. There are trans people who are fleeing their country because they were afraid to die and were trying to come to this country for a better opportunity, and they're being detained. So I think it's very hard for me to think about, other issues here too. And yeah, I think as Lorelei was saying, like our community around the world, how trans people are treated in Jamaica or other countries, it's atrocious. And I mean, simultaneously here, I don't want to discount the oppression or do any form of comparison, but I think simultaneously, it's this idea that because we're United States citizens, we have this idea that, oh, okay, because there's a certain degree of rights that are attained here, that at least for heteronormative folks, people again in that other community, are thinking like, oh, okay, well, now they can marry. Now, there's all of these resources that are gender affirming. The problems of the world are solved. It's all done. And it's not true. It's just not true. There's so much more systemically, so much more socially, so much more here and outside of here.
Yeah, I think this actually is a really great question. And thinking about one thing that's on my mind very frequently now is this concept where a lot of these issues seem to be like a matter of opinion to people. Like I'll bring in a popular culture anecdote. I don't know if people are familiar with what's kind of going on with J.K. Rowling, the author of Harry Potter. And I know that's a very devastating situation for a lot of people, including myself, who got a lot from those stories and got a lot from the magical world that was built by her as an author. And I think this kind of goes back to the concept Thomas was talking about earlier about how othering is actually dangerous. Because often when I hear people making critiques about, what this author has been doing and what she's been saying, people say, oh, well, that's her opinion. Everybody's allowed to have an opinion. And it's like, no, that opinion is costing people their lives, whether it be from attack and murder, like Thomas said, or whether it be from suicide, like Lorelai mentioned. It's these things aren't opinions. Human rights, I don't think, are something that can be debated and people can offer like, well, that's just how I think. And I think that's another thing. I'm talking about this reckoning that I think we're having as a people of learning about the harm that we've done to one another and how to recover from that harm. I think it's a lot of trying to remember that some things, should not be a matter of opinion. And when we treat them as such, it gives more ability for the oppressors to have free reign. If we talk about it as a social justice cause, or, oh, I voted for this candidate, he thinks this way, therefore I can think this way, it gets so dangerous so quickly. I think a lot about the civil rights movement. It was at a point where it was actually illegal to harbor runaway slaves, right? It was against the law. And so I think when we think about that now, it's easy to be like, oh yeah, of course, why, that's terrible. Why would that be a thing? But we're talking about the structure that we're living in. Illegal has nothing to do with morality. And so I think when we're thinking about these concepts every day, of what is opinion, what should be allowed to be debated in that way, and what is just hard facts of this is a violation of human rights. I think it's important to not get, I think I'll speak for myself, there are times where it's easy to kind of get a little lazy or lose my vigilance around how important these subjects are, especially in circles like when it comes to pop culture. So really, being aware that these are consistent issues, they have been consistent issues, and we can't argue about them as if it's just a matter of choice of what you choose to believe. I hope that made sense, but it is something that very much comes up for me. And it is disappointing that J.K. Rowling feels that way, but in response, I am protesting her beliefs because I know they are dangerous. Therefore, I'm protesting her as a person. And that's sad because I loved Harry Potter, like I said, but you have to take a stance and you have to have this kind of zero tolerance policy when it comes to being complicit in other people's oppression.
Are we ready for the questions, Evan?
We are, yes. Thank you, Eliza.
Thank you. This has been so wonderful so far. Ashley, what you just said just reminds me of, I've had the same experiences and lots of arguments, honestly, with family members about Chick-fil-A. And I felt very similarly, like, it's just a chicken sandwich. Well, you know what? If the chicken sandwich was voting on your rights, I wouldn't eat it, if the money to profit. So I really appreciate you giving that voice to that. All right, we have tons of questions. The first one is a quickie. Vesper, you mentioned Taino, and I think I already said it wrong when you were introducing yourself. Can you explain what that is for the audience, please?
Sure. The Taino people, my people, are an Arawak people of the Caribbean, long thought to be extinct. There's a lot of lineage, and we are still very much alive. We're folks who are indigenous of the Caribbean, largely parts of Florida, the Taino people. I think when you're thinking about Taino people, they're usually people of specifically Cuba, Puerto Rico, or the Dominican Republic.
Thank you. So the next question is, I think for everybody, how can people outside the queer community provide meaningful support in an affirmative, proactive way? So whomever wants to answer first.
Well, I'll take this. Educate yourself. Read, watch videos of people speaking, learn about this community. I think, and this is part of white privilege also, is that we feel like myself being a part of that community as well, is that we feel like there's just no need, to learn about other people that are outside of what we consider to be normal. And so to really, and by the way, I don't think we're ever going to be perfect at supporting people, with other identities, but it's I personally, I think it's our civil duty to educate ourselves about other communities, listen to these people, learn from these people, and drop a lot of our assumptions that we already know enough.
Yeah, go ahead, Ashley.
Sorry, I saw that Lorelei also had her hand up, but I think to piggyback off what you said, Thomas, is believing people when they talk about their experiences. I think that is true for me as a Black woman. I've had conversations around that, and also as an LGBTQ plus person, this concept of I'll share what's happening to me, I'll share how I think or feel about what's going on. And people start with that whole, but are you sure that's what they meant when they did that? Or are you absolutely positive that that's what your boss meant when they said it like that? And that constant default to, are you sure, is so, it's been traumatizing for me to think about how my experiences and the way that I share them are always to be questioned, and there's always another side. So I think always trying to avoid playing that devil's advocate role, both when it comes to race and when supporting and talking with LGBTQ plus folks, letting them use the language that is meaningful for them, but also checking those biases and being silent when people are sharing about what they need is really important for me.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, I completely agree about language and the importance of letting people define their own language and using and mirroring that back. Lorelei, did you want to jump in too?
Yeah, so earlier when we were talking about othering, both Vesper and Ashley pointed out, it might have been at different times, but they both mentioned how it's easy for other people in the LGBT community to hurt one another. And Thomas, what you just said about how you don't even know like how much help you can offer, all of this ties into the fact that peer support is so important, talking to other people who have shared experiences with you. And what I'm kind of realizing right now as we're all talking is that it's not even like necessarily about supporting actively, and it's much more about not harming, frankly, like, because if you're not doing harm, you're actually doing better than 99% of people. And like, personally, I can only speak for myself, but I feel it when people are actively not harming. It's like noticeable and very well appreciated.
Oh, yeah. Vesper, do you want to jump in on this or no?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's understanding. I think in the notion of education and a lot of these things are important, but I think understanding that, non-binary people do not owe you gender neutrality in their representation. Trans people do not owe you, the specific physical representation or owe you eroticism. Gay people do not owe you, suppression of their sexuality and romantic, nature in public. All of these things that people could start understanding that, that is not owed. We as oppressed people do not owe you that, is a good starting point.
Yes, I feel like I want that on a t-shirt, Vesper. We don't owe you that. All right, another question. Lorelei referenced the recent findings from the National Survey on LGBTQ plus youth mental health. I'm wondering what we can do in schools and in education in general to better support the mental health of LGBTQ plus youth. Who would like to answer first? You're so polite to each other.
This was in terms of education.
Yeah, I think in the schools. Yeah, in the schools particularly.
I think for myself, there's a lot to that. There's a lot of places where we could start. I think something that could be a less emotional distressing in an environment I think utilization of pronouns. I think a lot of people think that when we, put up pronouns, it's like, why do I need to put up pronouns? I'm not trans, I'm not queer. Like what is it's actually actively saying, like, I'm intending to make this an inclusive space and as inclusive as possible. And I actually care about your feelings and you as a person. And also, like, this is secondary to my name and my identity and how I want you to refer to me in this space. So I think that is something that is just needed across the board. Good starting place. Also, that this industrialist way in which the education system is set up is not working. There's many components to that, but alongside that, there is a traditionalist understanding and a gendered way of being when it comes to career paths, to the types of education people are receiving vocationally, right? So like women have to go to beauty school. Men have to go and, be a mechanic, this and that, like all of these career paths and understanding. And then along with that, do you okay, so you are a woman, or you are now like, or you are a man. So like a man who was coming into a space, I'm going to say a cis man, primarily in education space. You will learn science, you can learn math, you can learn all of these things. Someone who is AFAB, assigned female at birth, it's not always the case. And then when it is a trans person who's in the space, often their identity is not taken seriously in that space. And then the categorization from the perspective of the teacher and the schooling administration, that ends up affecting how the student can learn, because of it ends up being an emotionally distressing space. Yes, 99% of the time, people will do harm. So.
Yes, go ahead, Thomas.
So making a really strong commitment to hiring LGBTQIA teachers, that makes a huge difference. And it has to be a concerted effort. We are not going to hire people who are coming from marginalized communities unless we make a really commitment. We speak about it in our administrative meetings, that this is what we're committed to doing. But that can help set an example for children, that it's okay to be who they are. And the other thing, is there anything that you can bring into the environment that helps normalize being from, or normalizes these communities? There was an organization I worked for, mental health agency. I simply made the ask if they could put a rainbow flag outside our offices, and they absolutely refused. Like, that was just like, so they were so, I just couldn't believe, the resistance to doing that. But something that's simple, having a rainbow flag, a trans flag, flags that represent other communities, can make a huge difference. Anytime I go into a town, I see a rainbow or trans flag, I feel safe. I mean, it has an immediate effect on my physiology.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else want to jump in, or should I go to the next question? All right, I'll keep going. Sorry, now my phone is scrolling. Okay, so I really like this question. What is one message that you would like to give to, or to offer those who have othered you? So what is one message that you would like to offer those who have othered you? Ashley, did you have your hand up right away?
I did. And it's funny, I'm laughing because I think all of the panelists just now started cracking up. I wonder if it's the same thoughts around how much time do we have? I think, thinking about, again, going back to language, I keep bringing it up, but I think language is one of the best tools we have in seeing folks, hearing folks, and allowing people to share what they're going through. And I also think about language as being one of the best tools we have to hurt each other and erase who we are and change the way that we're talking about each other's experiences. So I think a lot about language, just really trying to change that. And I think too, from another layer, again, of being a Black woman, this, if I could think back to that partial that I went to and what went wrong and what was said, I think the childish answer is just to tell people, like, you don't know me. Like, how can you ever come to me and tell me what you know about me, and being able to talk about my experiences that way? But I think it's just a lot of wanting to help people change their language about how they talk about our experiences. But I am going to leave it there because I know we don't have enough time for me to go on and on around this one. But yeah, it's a very real thing.
Who else?
I don't have too much time either to like really delve into all of this, but to start, I'll share a little piece of my story. When I was 16 years old here in Worcester, I was jumped, and that led to a puncture wound in my lung, primarily from an assault. And I almost died. I spent 3 days in St. Vincent's Hospital here in Worcester, and the police, because of my mental health history and me being a trans youth on the street, thought that I did this to myself, that it was a suicide attempt. So when I think about that othering, and I think about the social construct of safety and policing from both police that exist in a law enforcement role, but also social workers, mental health providers, therapists, others who police thought, police accessibility, police things, that think very carefully about the preconceived notions and what you are holding on to when you meet with a trans person of color, queer person, a gay person, anyone who is other than you.
Yeah. Thomas, do you want to jump in or?
No, so what I want to say to people who've othered me is just stop it. That's all. But I agree with everything very much that Ashley and Vesper said.
I do too. Yeah. What about you, Lorelei?
One quick thing that I have found for myself in life to be very helpful is this sort of saying, we are bound by the words we learn until we learn the words that we mean. And I would just want them to take that statement to heart.
Okay. How does your queerness affect the way that you seek health or mental health help, if at all?
So I think it often, it's a lot of an explanation. So like for me to come into a space and then to be like, for them to be like, well, how do you identify with your gender? Then, I could say I'm agender or non-binary. And then the therapist might be like, so you're gay, so you're this, so you're that. And then it's like, explain more. And then the conversation has really veered into this fascination with who am I to them and who am I to this society than it is actually about my emotional distress. And it's even more emotionally distressing. And then when I think about intersectionality and in terms of being a BIPOC queer person, I think about how some therapists think that we live in a society that is post-racism and that they can diagnose me with something like anxiety or depression and just tack on that label. It makes, the mental health service system unappealing because I'm afraid that it's going to put me through more emotional distress.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Thomas, Ashley, Lorelei. No, keep going. Okay. Other than eliminating conversion therapy and properly funding programs, is there anything else that people in power should know to do for our community?
So I think that one big thing that has proven effective everywhere they exist is peer-run respites. places where you can drop in and stay for days. I think there should be many, many, many more peer-run respites across the world. I also think that just more peer support in general. And also, I just think that everyone should have food and shelter and clothes too.
Yeah, go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, I don't have a lengthy response to this, but I just think a lot about, I don't know. Yeah, as I start talking, I completely lose my train of thought as usual. One thing that came up for me a lot was thinking about just the idea of representation. I think when we're thinking about, I think it was Thomas that brought it up earlier, and same with Vesper, this concept of when we think about the LGBTQ community, we often think of monogamous, cisgendered white men or monogamous, cisgendered white women. And so I think if that's always, again, the only image we ever see when we're talking about our community, and if those are kind of the only voices that we're thinking about when we're talking about making change, it really is just a very, very narrow scope. Not that those people aren't important, not that their needs aren't valid, but if that's the only viewpoint we're looking at it from, then I think we're really missing out on, a broader range of people who need support. So, and I also completely agree with what Lorelei said around more peer respites, more peer supports, just across the board. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I'm waiting, Vesper, for you to jump in and say, oh, and there's a new peer respite in Worcester and promote Karaya, but I'll do it for you. There's a new peer respite through the Kiva centers in Worcester called Karaya, and they've already had, I think, is it over 100 guests since you opened, Vesper? Is that the right number? Yeah. So
yeah, 145. So I spend a lot of my time doing is talking to folks and making sure they come in. And I think, along with that, the goal is to have more. I think our original goal for the peer support movement was to have 6 in the state of Massachusetts. Right. So,
and we have 2 now, right?
We
2?
need 4 more. Yeah.
Yeah, 4 more. Okay. I think this should be the last question because ending on a strength note, maybe. What are your wishes for the younger generation? What is wisdom you would like to share?
Oh, if I could answer this,
Please.
I say this all the time that like I just dream of a world where being transgender or being non-binary is strictly a good thing. It's only positive. You get to just wake up and be like, oh, I get to be the person that I want to be today. I've had this like realization, and that can change on a whim, and you'll be supported and loved and embraced. And that's the case for sexuality as well. I feel like through this whole time I've been talking about the trans experience because that's my own experience, but I just think every person should just be able to wake up and look forward to their day, regardless of who they are.
Yeah, go ahead, Thomas.
Well, I hope for the next generations to come after them that my biggest hope is they don't have to live in fear. And I never got to enjoy, I've been thinking about this a lot. I never really got to enjoy my sexuality, when I was a teenager, when I was a young adult, and even so much of my adult life, because there's been so much fear attached to being sexual, with a man. And I didn't get to go through that kind of normal sexual development that a lot of heteronormative people get to go through, and that's so tragic. That's just so tragic, because sex is one of the most beautiful things that we have in life, and so I wish that people live so comfortable with who they are that they can enjoy that, as every human being has a birthright to enjoy.
Yeah. Vesper or Ashley?
I think, for queer liberation to not be such a radical concept, that's the kind of the theme I'm hearing, the fact that we need to talk about liberation in the first place, the fact that, we are shamed and put into this place, that there would be a world that would no longer need that. And that's my hope for young adults. And, I see us going in that direction to a degree, but we have gone into that direction before and pedaled back. And the thing is that, you know, in order for us to continue to do that, I think it's foundational that we alter our society, to alter institutions, to alter the interpersonal, to alter the perceptions within ourselves.
Yeah, the pedal back is scary. Ashley, you want to jump in? No? Evan, I just want to see if you want to answer that question as well, since.
Oh gosh, I was sort of preparing to wrap us up, so I wasn't really thinking about an answer to the question. But I did just want to point out that I just found out that Saturday, May 22nd, is International BU Day. So I think that kind of goes along with what we're talking about here at the end. Yeah, I think that would be a beautiful thing if we could all be not just comfortable with who we are, but proud of it. And we could feel like that wasn't a radical or revolutionary thing. So thank you to each and every one of our panelists so much for sharing your perspectives and experiences with us today. Also, thank you to Eliza Williamson for facilitating the audience questions, and to the NAMI Mass staff, as well as the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Awareness Committee of the NAMI Mass Board for all of their work behind the scenes to coordinate these panels. I also want to take this opportunity to remind you that our annual NAMI Walk will stream live from 9:30 a.m. to roughly 11 a.m. on this Saturday, May 22nd, which is International BU Day. This year we have lots of music, singing, poetry, and speakers for you to enjoy hearing from. The Facebook Live URL is going to be in the chat. And I hope you'll join us for the celebration of mental health for all on Saturday. And finally, thank you to our audience for attending. I hope that members of the LGBTQ+ community felt seen and represented, and that everyone leaves feeling encouraged and inspired tonight. So thank you very much to everyone, and have a good night.